One of the topics I'm particularly interested in my research is Lewis as a literary writer and Narnia as a literary place, by which I don't mean terribly highbrow or terribly difficult, but engaged with text, engaged with other literature, engaged with myth and folklore and tale and things like this. And there are a few reasons, I think, why it makes sense to study Lewis from this point of view and to think about Narnia as a literary place. Firstly, of course, is that Lewis was a literary scholar. He's often famous, particularly in Christian circles, for his apologetics, for his preaching, for his reflections on the Psalms. But he spent his working days teaching literature, thinking about literature, and he was a voracious and almost pathological reader of literary text all the way through his life. Most of his weeks would have been spent teaching medieval texts like Gawain and the Green Knight, or early modern texts like Spenser. And I think some of his most interesting works actually are on those literary topics. So books like The Allegory of Love, which is a study of, well, allegory and courtly love across hundreds of years, or English literature in the 16th century, open brackets, excluding drama, close brackets, which sounds a trifle dry as a title, but he regarded it in many ways as his masterwork. It was one of the volumes of the Cambridge History of English Literature, and it gives an incredible insight into Lewis's mind and his way of thinking about writing and books. There are a number of things that I've noticed in Narnia that only come into focus because I've been wandering around what he says about 16th century poetry or whatever. So yeah, Lewis himself is a literary bod, more literary than almost anyone, I think. It's also, I think, key to parts of his theology. It's certainly one of the keys to his spiritual biography. Lewis is someone who came back to faith partly through thinking about story and myth and text. As you probably know, he started off, he was brought up in a Christian family, then he became an atheist as a young man, and one of the things that worked his way back to belief in some God, and then eventually to the saving belief in Jesus Christ, was this sense that the world was imbued with true myth, with true story. And this plugs into a current of sort of cultural discussion and theological discussion around at the time. A lot of people, I think, instinctively saw myth as disproving religion, specifically disproving Christianity. There are, books like J.G. Fraser's Golden Bough, which is a famous study in comparative myth and religion, pardon me, and scholars like Ronald Hutton have pointed out the way in which the more Fraser compares different myths and saying, over here we have a dying and rising god, over here we have a fertility cult, over here we have the miraculous birth of a young god from a goddess who's said to be a virgin, over here we have a pairing of a sort of mother consort and a divine child. The more he was implying, and by the way, there's nothing special about Christianity. There's a lot of the trend, I think, of thought within mythological studies and comparative religion was away from an idea of uniqueness, which made sense if people were coming from a Christian culture, in some sense, certainly a Britain that had an established church, whose public rituals and public institutions were scaffolded or frameworked by Christian language. And Lewis himself writes in one of his works that this was his instinctive attitude towards myth, and that when he read the New Testament as a young man, he expected to find the vegetable god of Fraser, the god who goes into the earth and then rises again to mimic the cycle of the agrarian year. He expected to find the dying god who is sacrificed by his followers in order to ensure a good harvest. And he picks out that line in Paul about the seed that dies and produces much grain, etc. Although Lewis notes that he didn't find much of that. He was surprised that what was supposedly the answer to Christianity, that it was a more refined, sophisticated version, or less refined and sophisticated, depending on your views, of a fertility agrarian cult. That wasn't as much in evidence in the text as he thought it was. And so gradually Lewis, through his fascination with myth, he was always a great lover of myth and folk tale, particularly Norse myth, but also classical myth. He gradually came, largely, he says, crystallised through conversations with J.R. Tolkien and Hugo Dyson, towards seeing these multiple myths not as disproofs of Christianity, not as proofs that Christianity was yet another collection of fertility myths and mother and son consort stories, but that these were refractions of the one true myth, that there had been a time when myth became flesh, and when the great pattern that can be seen in various cultures and various stories happened once and happened in its definitive form. And that many of these can be read as either preparations for Christ or simply as shards of the Logos, or refractions from this one true central myth. So reflecting on story and reflecting on narrative and the relationships which stories have with each other is an essentially theological matter, I think, in Lewis's imagination. It was certainly, as I say, part of his spiritual biography. And myth and story becomes part, I think, of the theological landscape of Narnia itself. And there's a hint to this relatively early on when Lucy meets Mr. Tumnus and goes to tea at his cave, of which more later. And whilst he's making the brown toast and sardines and tea and whatever it is, she takes a look around his cave and she notices some books on his bookshelf, which is one of my absolute favourite details in all of Narnia, because they have remarkable titles. One of them, I think, is called Nymphs and Their Ways. One of them is The Life and Letters of Silenus. And one of them is called Men, Monks and Gamekeepers, A Study in Comparative Folklore. And one is called Is Man a Myth? All of which say, perhaps it's my favourite bit because I'm a sad little man who likes bookshelves. But and Tolkien hated this, by the way. Tolkien just there's a bit where he's talking to one of the other Inklings, and he says, "Nymphs and their ways. Does the man know what he's doing?" Because obviously there's a joke here, there's a satire that if we have such books in our world, then presumably there are biographies of notables of the past, such as Silenus and his private letters. And there's, one perhaps assumes that Mr. Tumnus's grandfather was a man of the naughty 90s, the 1890s, and knew people like P.G. Woodhouse's Drones Club. But it's those latter two books that I think are so interesting. Is Man a Myth? And Men, Monks and Gamekeepers, a study in comparative folklore, or comparative legend, if I'm getting that right, because it turns the lens round on us, particularly on Lucy. It turns round this idea that we are seeing this world of wonders and strangeness and the fantastical and potentially the miraculous, and we suddenly find it looking back at us in a really quite disconcerting way. Because I assume that these are the equivalent of cryptozoological titles, or indeed Fraser's The Golden Bough. These studies of we've heard these stories of things called monks and gamekeepers, and if they exist, what relationship do they really have to each other, and in what sense can we truly be said to believe in a gamekeeper? Is a gamekeeper a symbol of our collective fawn unconsciousness that we're projecting out into the woods? Actually, one of the students from a Narnia reading group that I ran had a brilliant take on that we were saying, why men, monk and gamekeepers, because we were going through, page by page, and they said, well, if you are, if you like, on the other side of the wardrobe, if you are a faun, or a centaur who lives in the crags and the woods, these are liminal people to you. These are the people that you're most likely to meet at the edges of your world. They had this brilliant idea that, monks who sort of, go and live in Cenobitic hermitages and that kind of thing, on the edges of civilization, and gamekeepers who are wandering through the woods on their own and things. And they have this rather charming idea that what sort of fairies and selkies are to us, the fauns and the centaurs might have this idea that we are these charming, whisty, elusive, whimsical creatures who wander in our tweed through the woods. And that's how they see us. You know, all that we think about their world, they think about ours, except, say, for the other end of the telescope. And that's happened, it happens even more sharply, I think, with Lucy, when Tumnus is very excited to meet her and says, "Am I right in thinking that you're a daughter of Eve? I've never met a daughter of Eve before." And Lucy says, "I'm a girl." And he says, "Oh, but you are what I think they call a human." And she says, "Well, of course I'm human, it's a moment of comedy." But Lucy is, again, seeing herself through a different lens. She thinks of herself as a girl, but the story implies to us that for a faun, for Mr. Tumnus, meeting a daughter of Eve is something more extraordinary and glorious and slightly scary than meeting a warlock or a centaur or even a talking lion, etc. So not only is, I think, myth and story very important for Lewis and his own personal spiritual sort of biography, it's woven into the fabric of the stories, and not only myth itself, not only creatures from myths and stories and folk tales, but the idea that we're being brought into myth and story and we're becoming the subject of it. So yeah, it's a topic that absolutely fascinates me, and I think you can see evidence that Lewis is a very elusive writer. He makes references and quotations. I'm not sure how consciously. As I say, he was a pathological reader. One of the reasons why he was able to do his literature papers at university so well and so quickly was that he had read an awful lot of what we might think of as a standard course before he got to university. He'd read all of Donne in English, and he'd read all of Spencer and this kind of stuff. And so when he came to write his essays, he wasn't reading the text for the first time. He was delivering himself of his opinions, or at least when he went to hear the Don's lecture, they were lecturing about things that he knew the content, and he was now listening to their arguments and listening to their sort of propositions and things. Anyone who's read Lewis' apologetic work will know that he is a man who believes in opinions, taking a view on something and arguing your view. He is a very elusive writer. He throws out references, he cites things, and he embeds little images and little sort of quotations within his fiction. So that, if you like, is the rationale for reading Lewis in this literary way, in this sort of myth-soaked way. And having argued then that it's worthwhile to approach Lewis in this way, it's worth thinking about what happens when you do. What things one notices approaching Lewis as a literary writer, a writer engaged with other texts, with other stories and with myth and whatnot. And sometimes they're just little allusions. So I'm convinced that the opening of The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, once there were 4 children and the names were Peter, Susan, Edmund and Lucy, I hope I'm quoting that correctly because it's embarrassing if I'm not, is in some sense evoking the beginning of The Tale of Peter Rabbit by Beatrix Potter. Once there were 4 rabbits, Flopsy, Mopsy, Cottontail and Peter. One was called Peter, which is significant. And I suspect that, firstly because it sounds a bit the same, but also because Lewis has written elsewhere about how A, he likes Beatrix Potter, and B, he doesn't see that there's a disjunction between literature for children or simple literature or folk fairy tale and high ideas and high writing and this kind of stuff. He tells an anecdote in a couple of different places about how he offended or sort of slightly took someone aback by listening to their literary theory and saying, "Right, and how would I apply that to The Tale of Peter Rabbit?" And they thought he was being rude, and he was saying, "No, honestly, if a literary theory works for Peter Rabbit, it works. If it doesn't work, it's not a literary theory, is it? So what's your problem?" So I suspect there's a little bit of echo of Peter Rabbit there. Pardon me. And what does that add to a reading of the text? Well, possibly not loads, but it does, of course, suggest that we're going to be in a story that's got talking animals in it, which is the case, where people are going to be in situations of life and death, though in a slightly different tone, and that we are entering a world that's magical, that's enchanted, And there are other examples when the Pevensies first find their way into Narnia, and there's a robin that they follow further into the woods before they meet the beaver. And I think it's Edmund who says, well, how do we know that the robin's on our side? How do we know that the robin is good? Now, he's already been slightly poisoned by the witch, hasn't he? Because he's already had the Turkish delight. And Peter says, well, robins have always been good in the books I've read. So I just feel it is. Let's go with it. Which you can see as Lewis papering over a crack in the fiction. If there is this world where they say there are centaurs and fauns and witches, how do we know what side to be on? But I suspect again that there's the way Lewis writes about the robin strongly reminds me of the robin in The Secret Garden. Another story where a child follows a bird and discovers this whole enchanted world, and it's a world, of course, in which the coming back to life of plants signals a spiritual revival, signals the unburdening of the heart, and sort of people coming into relationship with each other, which is one of the major themes, obviously, of Narnia. It particularly becomes focused in that chapter called Aslan is Nearer, in which Aslan never appears, but there's an awful lot of actually very Chaucerian and very Song of Songs stuff about the burgeoning of flowers and the singing of birds and the movement of water and wind and stuff, as if this is the presence of Aslan in the land. And so that there are these moments where you think, oh, there's a bit of shade of meaning there. Something's been brought in that slightly expands our sense of what's going on in this passage. Similarly, when Lucy first makes her way into Narnia, I get a very strong Dante vibe's a terrible word, note from that. And even if you go and compare it to the beginning of the Inferno, someone else lost in a wood, can't find the path. Even some of the word choices, so he talks about she found herself this, she found herself that, and Dante uses, I think it's retrovi, a couple of times, that just again suggests to me that somewhere at the back of Lewis's literary consciousness was the image of this everyman figure lost in a wood on the edge of this extraordinary, magical, but also metaphysical story, where the stakes are incredibly high. And of course, where at the centre, the greatest betrayal is ice. There's the ice at the centre of the Inferno, and there's the ice of Edmund's betrayal and the ice of the White Witch. As I say, sometimes these things can just tune us to the resonances and the echoes that are going on in Narnia, give us a sense of sort of the deeper significances, the literary tones and the modes that are going on. Also, when you sort of think of Narnia as a very literary and textually engaged place, it deepens and makes more sophisticated, I think, the biblical connections. There is sometimes a tendency, and not with everyone, but there's sometimes a tendency, I think, to read Narnia as a very simple code. That once you've worked out who Aslan is, once you know it's Jesus with a big furry tail, we already know this story and everything falls into place and that's all fine. That the code is broken and you can sort of throw away the encoded material because you already know the story. This, I think, is not a helpful way of reading Narnia, because as soon as you start taking its biblical connections seriously, you start noticing the differences. And the differences are in many ways more interesting than the similarities, I think. So there's a scene the night before Aslan dies, on the night when Aslan dies, and Susan and Lucy can't sleep, and they're very wakeful, and they get up and they see Aslan sort of padding around the green shadows of this clearing, and they go and they say, can we walk with you? And he says, actually, I would like that this night of all nights, but you have to go back when I tell you. And it's a very light, but I think a very skillful rewriting of the Garden of Gethsemane, with several details are there. I think they're allusions because they're so exactly opposite, which sounds a bit paradoxical, but it invokes the text by doing precisely the opposite, not something different, but something that's literally inverted. So rather than Jesus saying to the disciples, stay here, stay awake, could you not watch with me? Susan and Lucy are supposed to be asleep, but they can't sleep and they're awake, and they go and find Aslan, which I think is a fairly shrewd bit of rewriting for children who are probably more used to being supposed to be packed away for the night and being wakeful than they are thinking, oh, I've got 3 more duties to do and I still want to be asleep now. And he doesn't rebuke them for it. So it's altered for it to be a children's story. And the 2 girls take the place of the apostles in this story, and then they stay when he tells them to. And then, of course, they become the women standing at the cross, because they are the last people to stand with Aslan. And then they also become the women on the morning of the resurrection. There's again some very strong echoes of them sort of lamenting over his body, and thinking when they hear the cracking of the stone table, oh, the witches people have come back and they're doing something awful, and now they've taken the body, and could they, Lucy says, could they not just have left him alone? Do they have to do this as well? There's really strong evocation of, they have taken my Lord and I do not know where they have put him. Which is then again, echo upon echo, echoed by when he has risen. What Aslan says to them is now girls, or now children, catch me if you can. And they have this astonishing romp, and there's this sort of sense of delighting in the presence, the physicality of the risen Christ, which of course is an exact inversion of Nole me tangere. Rather than saying touch me not, he says touch me if you can, bosh. And they have, I think Lewis says it was, Lucy couldn't decide whether it was more like playing with a thundercloud or more like playing with a kitten or something like that. So there are these very precise allusions that are nonetheless different from the biblical text, and sometimes that happens in redistribution of material. So the description of the near sacrifice of Edmund, to me, evokes the binding of Isaac. There are these moments where there seems to be a connection that there's something ritualistic about it, and there's a knife being sharpened, and then he's rescued by sort of animals coming out of the sky. And Peter is also taken up to a cliff and shown Cair Paravel and the sort of the coast of Narnia. And there's an extraordinary moment where it says that the light was reflecting on the windows of the castle, so that it looked like a star on the seashore. Now, with Tolkien, I think we were very clearly in Marian territory here. Star of the sea, Stella Maris. With Lewis, I think this is the sounds of the seashore and the stars of the sky. So I think he's being told, you will be the king of Narnia. Not you will be the father of a great nation, but the equivalent of that, and we see a star shining on the seashore at this moment. And Lewis, I think, again instinctively or perhaps carefully, has both of those episodes, but they're separated. So there's no sense that somehow this is a reward for one, or the one is an exchange for the other. Lewis, when talking to his child audience, reproduces what seemed to him deeply significant and resonant images, but rearranges them narratively. So I think the differences can be as important, maybe more important than the similarities. And that's something you only get to if you approach this as literature, rather than you approach it as something that's retelling a Bible story, but we all know what the real story is, and anyway the text is just a sort of a hide or a camouflage for it. These meanings emerge more significantly when we take it seriously as literature. And that kind of literary connection, I think, also feeds into the theological strategies or the theological sort of tendency of Narnia at times. One example would be the end of, or near the end of Prince Caspian, where once again we're in Aslan romping territory, and Aslan and the train of Bacchus and the 2 Pevensey girls ride across Narnia, and the healing takes place, and at one point a jug of water is brought to an ill old woman, and she says, "Oh, that's wonderful. That tastes like beef tea or wine." And they come to a courtyard, I believe, where a man is beating a boy with a stick, and the stick starts to grow into his arm, and the boy laughs and runs away and is freed. And there's a scene where there is some unpleasant children being taught by a school teacher, and Aslan says to the school teacher, "Oh, you know, dear heart, it's me." And she says, "Oh, please don't. I want to, but I can't. Please don't." And the children turn into pigs and run away, and she joins their train, and it's all marvellous. And I think there are obviously echoes of the Gospels here, healing, water into wine, but they seem to be, again, either deliberately or not, chosen so that they can be read in terms of the Gospels or in terms of Ovid, because they're all stories of metamorphoses. Indeed, the old lady, when she drinks the water, says, "Oh, it does make a nice change," which I suspect is a joke. You know, this is a chapter about a nice change, about Ovid's metamorphoses. So that it strikes me there's a rewriting of the Pan and Syrinx legend, where instead of, in fact, several of the Pan stories, instead of turning into a tree to avoid violence, the tree grows into the man's arm to stop violence happening, and liberation takes place. And the little boys could be the Gadarene swine, but they can also be Odysseus men. And there's this, you know, she's not Circe, but she is a learned woman, and she is liberated from them rather than vice versa. Even as I say, the echoes seem to extend to the point at which she says, "Oh, please don't. I'd love to, but please don't," which seems to me to echo the "What hast thou to do with me, Jesus of Nazareth," where the man in the Gadarene story says, "No, please go away. Don't have anything to do with me." And that's it's both enormously enlivening, and I say it enriches the significance of the text, and I think is, particularly because it comes near the end of the story, something like Lewis's manifesto, or his his indulgence in turning Narnia into a place where classical myth and Christian truth can meet and mingle and be seen in each other and be both sort of images of liberation and images of joy. There is, of course, a long tradition of Christian writers using Ovid and rewriting Ovid. There's the Ovid Moralise. Writers like Gower or Henryson write their own sort of glosses on Ovid to turn an extremely pagan and licentious poet into a good Christian thinker. Some of which I think strike us as ludicrous these days or inappropriate. But I think something else is going on here. Something of that is going on here. It's not only that Lewis is enjoying Ovid, enjoying the Gospels, he is situating Narnia in a tradition of Christianizing the classical world, or seeking Christian meaning and Christian significance in those very familiar classical stories, in the same way as I talked about him seeing refracted shards of the Logos in pagan myth. And just one final example of the literary examples. When Lucy meets Mr. Tumnus, I mentioned earlier, and he invites her to tea, a lot of people have spent a lot of scholarly ink in very worthwhile ways over Mr. Tumnus. He's an intriguing figure. People absolutely love Mr. Tumnus. And sometimes on the internet they love him in concerning ways. There is some fan art out there that I don't think I needed to see. When I was looking for images when I was lecturing on The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, people have this incredible sort of engagement with him. And even when you come across people who've planned a Narnian-themed tea party or a Narnian-themed wedding or something, Tumnus is often there. Which is surprising, given that he's actually quite a minor character for most of the story, and he's a rotter. He betrays her. I mean, he then very bravely repents and helps her escape, and he's caught and tortured. But the image of the Tumnus Tea Party, I'm amazed that it's become this sort of celebratory image, because it's very sinister in the original. And a lot of people have pointed out that he appears to be a satyr. He has goat legs. He has horns. He's certainly not a sort of character that you would necessarily want a small girl to be meeting when she wanders into the woods. And I read that in terms of Lewis's engagement with stories about Pan, not only in classical Arcadia, but in 19th and 20th century literature. There are a load of people who are really into Pan in English literature in this period. Saki, the Hector Hugh Munro, who wrote under Saki, writes a couple of stories about Pan. And he appears in Arthur Machen's work, obviously. And there's a chapter that I think is particularly relevant of The Wind of the Willows, almost the central chapter of the novel, which some people haven't read, in fact, because it's not always reprinted. I think particularly in some American editions in the 20th century, it wasn't considered appropriate, because it's called The Piper at the Gates of Dawn, and it's when Ratty and Mole meet Pan. It's an astonishing chapter. The otter's child gets lost and everyone splits up and searches for him all around the riverbank. And they find this island that they've never seen before. And they have this sort of holy awe and dread falls upon them. And they see this divine figure with his beard and his goat legs and his horns, and he's protecting the otter's child. And they take the otter's child, and it's this astonishing sort of numinous, reverent description of this God at the centre of nature. And to me, Lewis is writing with and writing back to that. That he has his Pan figure, but it's a goat-legged horn figure who's got a few Christmas presents and is a bit prissy and has his volumes on his shelf, and is actually a bit of a moral coward, even though he eventually learns to sort of stand up and do the right thing. Not, I think, that Lewis is sort of poking fun at paganism and saying, oh, it's all silly and nonsense, and ridiculing it, but that Tumnus is the gateway to Narnia. Tumnus is the person who lives where, as it turns out, where the wardrobe lets into Narnia, and he's the first person that Lucy meets. So for Graham in The Wind of the Willows, he's the centre of the story. He's this mystical, deep heart of the English countryside. He's this nature spirit who imbues the rest of the story before and after him with meaning. For Lewis, he's the first step. He is fascinating, entrancing, and charming, and opens up this whole world, but he's not all there is. He's what lets you into Narnia, and he's where, he's the gateway where you might go in and then eventually meet Aslan. To me, that's what seems to me allusions to not only to say the myth of Pan, but specifically to literary texts that talk about Pan in Lewis's context, is a way of engaging with this excitement and sort of entrancement with the English countryside, which is very much part of the literature of the time, and then explaining it in terms of Christian metaphysics, or deepening it in terms of Christian metaphysics, that yes, there is something wonderful and significant and powerful at the root of nature, but it's not Pan. Pan's a way that you might get there.